Okay, Jeff, I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay, very good. All right, well, good evening. Good to see you all. Those of you joined us in person for dinner, and those of you joining us online as well. Always good to see you, and very much looking forward to our session this evening. We have typically quite a lot to cover. Now, those of you online, please, as we've said before, please don't hesitate to enter into the discussion, any relevant questions or comments you might have. And I know we have a chat feature down here. Sometimes I neglect to check it out though. So, you can unmute by just pressing your space bar and joining into the discussion. So we have three articles in particular that is on the agenda this evening. And now last week, we actually didn't have time to cover a couple of the articles we had sent out previously. But again, time is of the essence, and we don't really have time to go back to those. One of those articles in particular, by the way, and I think you all have a copy of it, it's called Shepherds for Sale. And it's a review of Megan Basham's book, Shepherds for Sale. And as the first sentence of that article says, it's a blistering indictment of evangelical leaders who, in the words of Megan Basham, traded the truth for a leftist agenda. The book sparked heated controversy on social media, quickly dividing evangelicals into pro and anti-Basham factions. Now, Megan Basham, as we mentioned last week, she has written for World Magazine in the past, I think for several years, and she's very perceptive. So if you haven't had a chance to read that article again, I would highly recommend that you do so. I think you'll find it extremely interesting. She's getting an awful lot of attention, both by those who support her views and by her critics. And she is really calling so many Christians and Christian leaders to task for ignoring some of the salient issues, important issues of our time. And so she has an awful lot to say. And whether you agree with her on every single issue or not, I think you'll find that article to be well worth the time. Her book came out a few weeks ago, I believe. It's gotten extensive reviews, some critical and some very laudatory. But again, it's a book that I think we all should be aware of and take note of. I believe, Ollie, your book club is going to be reading that, I guess, for next month. And Donna, you're in that book club as well. Oh, okay. So you've already gotten the book and started reading it and all. And Karen, are you in that?
I go sometimes. I'm going this time.
Okay. All right.
Millie's
So-
not here tonight, said she got the book and can't put it down, so.
Yeah. Millie Atkinson is highly promoting that book, and certainly it is one of those that's just generated an awful lot of attention this year, and rightly so. So Shepherds for Sale, Megan Basham. Okay. But as I said, we don't really have time to go through that particular article. I want to focus instead on the three that we sent out for tonight's session in particular. So I'd like to start with the article by Warren Cole Smith. And many of you are very familiar with him. He also used to be associated with World Magazine. In recent years, he has headed up a group called Ministry Watch. It's really a very, very informative website that is a great way to keep up with some of the trends, for better and for worse, that are going on in evangelicalism in particular, but Christianity in general. And so Warren has been virtually a lifelong acquaintance of mine. In fact, I taught him when he was a junior in high school. And then we reconnected many, many years later. And I was very pleased to see that, again, he's very much in the forefront of evangelical trends. And the title of his article is The Political Illusion. It's important to keep our priorities aligned with Scripture, especially during this political season. And so this is an article that I take exception to some of what he wrote, but generally speaking, again, it's something well worth spending some time on. So let's take a look at this article. And he begins by talking about how both political parties have completed their national conventions. On full display in nightly primetime broadcasts, news coverage between now and November will be dominated by political coverage. Candidates will spend billions of dollars on advertisements. If you didn't know any better, you might think all this political activity was the most important thing going on in the world today. Well, obviously, it is very important. And the reason it's extremely important is because the United States is, frankly, the only nation in the world that has the power, the capacity to affect world affairs in a positive sense. Now, we know there's other countries that have a lot of power and can affect world affairs in a negative sense: China, Russia, obviously Iran, perhaps, but only the United States has the power to affect any good in the world. And so we desperately need quality leadership. And so it's important that we pay close attention to what's going on and try to encourage as many people as we know to not only become informed and engaged, but also very much involved as well and become influencers. He goes on to talk about how that, as I just said, if you didn't know any better, you might think all the political activity was the most important thing going on in the world today. Well, it's certainly important and it warrants our attention. But he goes on to say, but fortunately, you are a Christian. You know better. However, many of our neighbors are not and do not. They have succumbed to what the French philosopher Jacques Ellul called the political illusion. Jacques Ellul was a very astute French social critic. I know him from his writings in the 1950s and early 1960s. And he wrote a book called The Totalitarian Temptation, which was a major work of scholarship back in those years. Now, he goes on to say, Warren Cole Smith goes on to say, if you ever read Ellul, you know that his ideas do not easily reduce to sound bites. That said, I think it's fair to reduce the political illusion to this: the illusion that politics plays a greater role in our lives than they do. Well, now there's another illusion that's very common among evangelicals, and that is the alternative, and that is that it's the illusion that politics is relatively unimportant. And I'm afraid that Warren is kind of, drifting in that direction, not totally, but anyway, and another thought that came to mind was when he brought up this book by Jacques Ellul, The Political Illusion. Now, here's somebody who lived in France during World War II, and it was hellacious under Nazi control. So certainly Jacques Ellul should take politics very, very seriously, considering, all that he witnessed and all at the time. Next paragraph says, Ellul explained the political illusion in his 1965 book, French title, The Illusion of Politics. It was published. Yes, okay, or words to that effect. It was published in English in 1967. Ellul's work is getting more attention from evangelical scholars today, as it should. Well, I'd say that's a little bit debatable. But the next paragraph says, Christians understand that what has gone wrong with the world cannot be fixed with political activism or culture war victories. Well, we certainly can make things better. It's not the final solution, obviously, to what's wrong in the world. That's a spiritual and a moral problem. But certainly politics plays an instrumental role and needs to be, again, taken very, very seriously and not dismissed as something that's just kind of optional in terms of Christian discipleship. No, it shouldn't be optional at all. And again, we are so privileged to live in a country that is the most Christian influenced in our heritage. It was the most Christian influenced nation in world history. And that's so much to be thankful for and to take very, very seriously. And along with blessings like that come great responsibilities as well. And so, yeah, what happens here in America matters. It matters just not only for Americans themselves, but in world affairs as well. And, we're not living in Bolivia or Bulgaria or Bangladesh or someplace. This country matters in terms of its influence on world affairs. And that means that it's incumbent upon us, again, to take all this with utmost seriousness, as well as an elementary part of a holistic approach to Christian discipleship. Warren goes on to say that Christians understand that what has gone wrong with the world can't be fixed with political activism or culture war victories. I have a lot of sympathy for the expression, quote, politics is downstream from culture. Well, I agree. I mean, politics is definitely downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from morals, moral values, and moral values, of course, emanate from spiritual, perceptions and so on. So I agree with him in that regard. He says, that's mostly true that politics is downstream from culture, but a more complete truth is that culture is downstream from theology and anthropology and ontology. Now, ontology may or may not be a familiar term to you. You can basically reduce the entire mammoth field of philosophy into two areas of study. And one is ontology or metaphysics, and the other is epistemology. Now, ontology or metaphysics, that's the reality of what is, what exists. And this could include physical matters. It could also include mental, concepts and spiritual realities as well. So that's ontology. That's what he's talking about. What is, what's real, you might say. Now, epistemology is how we can know anything is real or true, okay? So when you think about it, there's what is to be known and then how we can know it. So that's ontology and epistemology, and that basically incorporates the entire world of philosophy, as vast as that field is, okay? All right, so he's saying the culture is downstream from theology and anthropology and ontology. Politics and culture are both effects, not causes. He's quite correct about that. And the foundation of it all, again, are spiritual values, moral values, and so on, which condition, cultural mores and values. Politics and culture influence each other, sometimes in helpful ways and sometimes in unhelpful ways. He goes on to say that the abortion debate is a case in point. For many years, the pro-life cause was winning the hearts and minds of the American people, primarily because it operated upstream of politics. In other words, it tapped into people's moral consciousness in general. For most of the past 30 years, most Americans believe that abortion should have significant restrictions. I mean, even the Democratic Party. Remember Bill Clinton back in
It should be safe, legal, and rare.
safe, legal, and rare. Yes, the Clinton view on that. But the Democratic Party never speaks in those terms anymore. There should be a safe, legal, and rare. No, not at all. You know, it's abortion on demand, and there should be absolutely no restrictions. And this doesn't just apply. And if you follow all this pretty carefully, which most of you do, you realize that the Democratic Party has changed so much just in probably the last 6 or 8 years. And now many in the party, including some of their primary influencers, are calling for unrestricted abortion up to the time of birth. And some are arguing, no, actually, the abortion option, actually infanticide, should extend beyond birth because, frankly, you may not really like what comes out. And so you ought to have an option, you know, for a few weeks or whatever, to decide whether you want to keep this little creature or not. And
I got a package from Amazon and they let me send it back.
yeah, which is a wonderful non sequitur. Yeah. So
Saying people have certain expectations.
yes, that's true. So again, we've seen a massive shift in the consciousness, the moral consciousness of those who identify with the Democratic Party, and sometimes Republicans, some Republicans are following along as well. Yes.
Well, for the pulpit.
Oh, as loud as you can so they
Yeah,
can hear.
For the pulpit, we don't hear any longer any discussion about abortion from a biblical point of view.
Mhm,
Nothing.
mhm.
In many areas, they say, oh, that's political.
Yeah.
And it's a try and change.
Well, let me ask you a simple question. Would you trust anybody's moral opinions if they were conflicted on the issue of the sanctity of human life? I think most of us would say absolutely not. I mean, if you're confused or ambivalent on the sanctity of human life, you're not to be trusted on any moral issue. I mean, that's as black and white as it can possibly get. And so, yeah, there's just absolutely no excuse for reticence on the part of so many Christian leaders, you know, to speak out very forcefully on this issue. So let's move on here. Come down several lines in that particular paragraph that began the abortion debate is a case in point. He writes that when both political parties decided abortion could help them, then abortion became a wedge issue. And we see that going on in our current election as well. And the modification of the Republican Party's stance on abortion. It no longer made sense, he writes, for the two parties to work together on this issue. The abortion debate evolved from one which used persuasion and empathy to one which raw political power became the weapon of choice. And he goes on to talk a little bit more about that issue. Now, on the next page, the first full paragraph there in the left-hand column, Warren writes, quote, "In short, the pro-life movement won the legal battle, but lost the battle for the hearts and minds of the American people." He's talking about when Roe v. Wade was overturned in the Dobbs decision a couple of years ago. So he's saying the pro-life movement won the legal battle, but lost the battle for the hearts and minds of the American people. In fact, the techniques of realpolitik, what's he mean by realpolitik?
It's a Russian term that meant basically, let me think of a good English equivalent would be like, too bad for you. In other words, we're just going to use brute force. So realpolitik basically meant, for example, the CIA to help defeat communism, they had to deal with and sponsor and support. It's like John F. Kennedy said, President Kennedy said, we will oppose any foe and we will support any friend to ensure the success of liberty, right? So realpolitik means go, yeah, this guy is a total horrible person, but he's better in this country than the communists.
Well, in the most general sense, yeah, realpolitik is using power politics to push an agenda, and regardless of the morality necessarily of that issue.
I would say, Jeffrey, it's to act in your own best interests, regardless of ideology.
Yeah, acting in one's own interests or a nation's own interests. What else did you, regardless of
an ideology? In other
regardless
words,
of ideology.
you would use somebody who is a Nazi to attack your enemy, even though you may not agree with them.
Yeah. Well put.
It's an amoral.
Yes, concept, and we usually apply it to foreign relations and all. Henry Kissinger and people like that
But
were.
I'm sorry, the thought that came to mind was, in the absence of morals, then it's the old adage, might makes right.
That's right.
So
That's right.
We're untethered from the morality of it.
That's correct. Yeah. So as Dan said, I mean, it's an amoral position. Okay. Anything that I have the power to enact, I feel the freedom to do just that. Okay, morality aside. Next paragraph. That's not to say that we should abandon either political or cultural activities. Rather, I'm saying that the roots of our current malaise are more fundamental and more foundational. Well, yes, obviously, they're rooted in moral values, which again are expressions of spiritual concepts as well. Thank you. So the problem is that we have abandoned a biblical ontology, a biblical understanding of the nature of reality, essentially, and also biblical epistemology, how we can know that something is true and right and good and so on. Next paragraph says, in other words, the problem we face today is not so much that pagans are acting like pagans. We shouldn't be shocked, should we? The problem is that Christians are acting like pagans. And he says, we dress up our paganism in religious garb, but it is paganism nonetheless. And he's talking about the fact that so many Christians just pretty much concede these great moral issues to the trends of the time, to the zeitgeist, the trends of the day. This notion, he says, crystallized for me this week as I edited a story about a pastor's conference hosted by Turning Point USA, a conference we reported on here. At that conference, organizer Charlie Kirk said, quote, "There's only one way to save this country: awake the beast that is the American church." And Warren Cole Smith, who has a theology background, of course, takes much exception to the way Charlie Kirk said it. He said, the church is not a beast, it is the bride of Christ. And Kirk seems unaware that in scripture, the word beast is often used to describe Satan. So poor choice of words. But anyway, let's move on from that point. Now, the top of the right-hand column, it should also be clear by now that repairing the foundations of our society and culture will take more than legal victories. Of course, this is true, but of course, laws need to enforce basic moral principles. We have to keep that in mind as well. So, yes, we fight for, the rule of law, as it reflects true moral values. Next paragraph. So given our current state, is recovery even possible? And he goes on to argue that, yes, it's certainly possible, but I think, as all of us would say, there has to be a massive shift in the minds of Christians, in particular church leaders, and realizing the evils that confront us and having the courage, not only the foresight, but the courage to confront those and confront them aggressively. Otherwise, we just concede the culture war to those that are pushing this very, very corrupt agenda. Last paragraph, politics can be a tool that we use to love one another and serve one another. Certainly that's the case. He says, I hope you'll vote this November, but politics is not our only tool, and it's rarely the most effective. When we forget that, we have taken our eyes off the example of Jesus and succumbed to the political illusion. Well, okay, there's some truth in that, but again, we don't want to minimize the fact that, again, politics matters, and it's an integral part of our Christian discipleship. Well, let me just pause briefly. And any comments, any questions, or whatever? Yes, Dan?
Like you, I take considerable, maybe you wouldn't use the word considerable, I take considerable exception to Warren Cole Smith's analysis here. I won't go into the background, but there's a certain political organization that tries to educate Christians and conservatives to really be activists, and their basis is kind of real politics. It is basically trying to point out certain political facts. And if you have to give me a moment, I'll read a couple of them.
Okay.
All
right.
Basically, most people in our line of work, so to speak, people who are Christian conservatives who want to make a mark on the world and kind of save the country or leave it in a better shape than where we were. We have certain ideas about, well, we need education, we need persuasion, we need all these things. And these people, this particular political outfit, is like, no, and here's why. And so I'm just offering this, y'all. We can discuss it, think about it, come over and hit me on the shoulder or whatever. But basically, they point out that if you start with 100% of all people to persuade, then you need, for the percent for victory is 50% plus one. Well, but only 70% are eligible to vote. So really, you just need 35% plus one. But only or eligible, only 40% are registered to vote. So then you just need 20% plus one. But only 20% vote on election day. So that just leaves you 10% plus one. 7% always vote for Republican, 7% almost always vote for Democrat. So that leaves just 6% of the country that you have to persuade on an average election. They're arguing. And therefore, all you need is 3% plus one, and you've gotten your law passed, your policy enacted, your politician elected, and so on. So that, this is Warren Cole Smith would be throwing things at me at this point and say, yeah, but you're doing this roughshod, you're doing this over these people's feelings, you're doing this over this. We're not being winsome, we're not being helpful, we're not coming alongside them and educating them. Yeah, well, maybe not, but we have certain duties. We believe we have. I think we have certain duties that we need to perform.
Yeah. Well put. Yeah, and we hear all the time that this election could be just razor thin, and so again, we need to be well informed, and we need to understand that as Christians, we have a certain amount of influence that we want to use, in the most positive way possible. And rather than just ignoring this oftentimes controversial issue of politics, no, we need to, be well rehearsed in how we can make the case that we want to control all the evil as much as possible. Now, no candidate is ideal, especially in this election, that's for sure. But nonetheless, it's about containing and controlling as much evil as possible. And we have a moral responsibility to do just that. Yes.
He makes the comment in that paragraph that says on the first page, politics and culture, both effects and are not causes. And it is true that every effect has a cause, but not every cause is an effect. there makes sense. However, he disagrees with himself in the last paragraph where it says politics can be a tool. Well, tool, like a hammer, causes things. So I think he contradicts himself there. And I think politics is very much a tool. And it does shape culture and it does shape worldviews. So it is not neutral in any sense.
Right.
In that regard. He talks about, also, he talks about our current state, is recovery possible? And the short answer is yes. Well, yes, that may sound like a nice answer, but there are many examples in the Old Testament where that was not the case, where God judged the nations and they were subject to judgment and there was nothing they could do about it. So I don't think he considers the fact that a country can be judged, and that is God's will. It's not God's will to cover every nation. Matter of fact, no nation have ever survived.
Right.
No empire has ever really survived.
Right.
So I have some problems with his positivism there, that he doesn't consider that, nor does he make mention of the consequences of sin on any of this. In other words, what's the consequence
ingrained in it all.
When you say that culture is downstream from anthropology and theology, that's what it said. Well, the understanding, the pervasiveness of sin destroys that relationship. It's not a pure relationship at all.
Correct.
So,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think as American Christians, we've been so privileged. We are the most privileged, and by the way, also the most prosperous Christians in all of Christian history. And there's a tendency to think that somehow we, to some extent at least, we deserve this. And of course, that's totally fallacious. And we have to be prepared that in this election could really turn things dramatically against the Christian faith in every aspect of American life, and we better be prepared for the consequences.
Against prosperity.
Pardon me?
Against prosperity. Because going into a Marxist-like political system.
Yeah, those don't work so well, do they?
Everyone's equally poor.
Right. Well, except the elite. Yeah, except the elite. Yeah.
So that's where these people are taking us.
Yeah.
Quite clear.
Yeah.
But
well, under the guise of equity, yes, among other things.
I think before political argument, battle, there has to be education of the people, of the growing up kids.
Yeah. And of course, that's totally failed.
Like I think we all do, of what is America and what's the starting point and what's our heritage? Why did we become so wealthy? Liberty. The answer is liberty.
Yeah.
We all should understand that, be able to explain it, but that's not being taught in the schools.
No, not at all. No, the left has totally taken
right
over in that regard. Yeah.
The issue is the education of our children and even ourselves. And it's
okay.
very frustrating.
Yeah. By the way, we just got a message here. Please speak louder.
Okay.
And so
I think we're going to get to useful idiots later, aren't we?
Yes.
I admit that my life, I'm so torn. I'm 84. But I am so torn with this country and so weepy inside for this country. It so happens that my hobby has been American history for 72 years. Well, and I see this, I've seen it coming and I've seen it continuing, and I just cry for it. Well, yeah. It's so, we're so sad. Again, we're the most privileged Christians who've ever lived, and we have generally very, very poor leadership, have for actually quite a number of decades, and we're just allowing our
our great culture and society to be, perverted and all with relatively little opposition. Well, the next article here, and we need to move on, is Eric Metaxas, Francis Schaeffer, and the Great Evangelical Disaster, Two Prophets and Their Critiques of Compromised Christianity. And this is written by someone who I greatly admire. This is John West, who is a leader in the Discovery Institute out in Seattle, Washington. And John is a great thinker, and his views are to be taken, I think, very, very seriously in most everything he writes. He begins by talking about how 40 years ago, evangelical Christian thinker Francis Schaeffer, we do an entire course on Francis Schaeffer. I wrote a book on Francis Schaeffer. So evangelical Christian thinker Francis Schaeffer died after a long battle against cancer. He went out with a bang, not a whimper. A few months before his passing, he published his final book called The Great Evangelical Disaster. Some of you have probably read that or familiar with it in general. Many of his last weeks were spent promoting that message, the Great Evangelical Disaster. Schaeffer's book indicted the evangelical leadership class here in America in particular for abandoning historic Christianity in a quest for cultural acceptance, especially in the areas of biblical authority, the values of human life, sex, of course, and politics. In that book, Schaeffer wrote, quote, "The problem of evangelical accommodation is that it has constantly been in one direction, that is, to accommodate with whatever is in vogue or the trends and the fads of the day." He goes on to say, "It is the same world spirit which is destroying both our church and our society." Now, Schaeffer ended his book by calling for a new generation of Christians willing to confront the world rather than simply embrace it or, endure it, I guess you could say. If you come down to the next paragraph, Schaeffer warned that if loving confrontation did not occur, basically as Jesus taught, speaking the truth in love, that's loving confrontation, then evangelical Christianity would lose its identity. He wrote, "If we do not have the courage to draw lines, even when we wish we did not have to do so, then history will look back at this time," and by the way, he's writing here in the early 80s, and history would look back at this time as the time when certain evangelical colleges went the way of Harvard and Yale. We've seen that happen, Wheaton and others as well. When certain evangelical seminaries went the way of Union Theological Seminary, really kind of the prototype of so-called progressive liberal Christianity in New York City, and so on. Now, he was saying that these trends need to be seriously addressed. In general, they were not seriously addressed. And so we're, I think, living with consequences now. "I was an undergraduate at a state university," writes John West. "When I first read Schaeffer's book, it helped inspire me to want to be part of the solution." Now, how many Christians have you ever talked to and they implied that they want to be, they want to help change our society and culture. They want to be people who are part of the solution. Don't most just follow the secular trends, and that is, need to get a good education so I can get a good job, make a lot of money, buy a good house, and so on. And yeah, I'll go to church and everything, and try to maintain church life and whatever. But as far as seeing our role in society and our role in the kingdom of God as being a force for change, so few think in those terms. Francis Schaeffer did, and he encouraged many Christians back in the 60s and 70s to think in those terms, but it never became really the norm. So he's talking about how we need a new generation of biblically faithful Protestants, and also the alignment with faithful Catholics, especially when it comes to great cultural, moral issues like abortion, for instance. Now, you see there the subtitle, The Great Evangelical Disaster Today. Eric Metaxas's provocative book, Religionless Christianity, we won't be talking about that much in this class because we'll spend most of our time on his letter to the American church. But this follow-up book, Religionless Christianity, came out just a few months ago, and it's very much worth reading, I'll say. And so he talks a little bit about Metaxas's book, Religionless Christianity, if that's not a familiar term to you, and it can be kind of a confusing term. He's using that term, religionless Christianity, in the same sense that Dietrich Bonhoeffer did, and you can read about it here in the article. Now, first and foremost, like Francis Schaeffer's The Great Evangelical Disaster, Eric Metaxas's Religionless Christianity indicts Christian leaders today for being shaped by the secular culture, rather than thinking in terms of countercultural, Christian values. You come on down to near the bottom of that column, left-hand column there. I can already predict, writes John West, some of the criticisms that are likely going to be leveled at Metaxas's new book. Many will complain it's too harsh, it's too political, and so on. But these are people that, not only do they hardly conceive that we have a culture war going on in America, but they think that there's something basically unchristian about that, about, standing for what's right and good and truth. And so, their idea is, no, we need to be nice. That seems to be the ultimate virtue with people like this, is we need to be nice and very considerate of others, even when their worldview and their values and beliefs are absolutely antithetical to everything Christianity stands for. The last paragraph in the left-hand column, I'm sympathetic to some of these concerns. In other words, we want to speak the truth, but we want to speak the truth in love. Okay. So I'm sympathetic to some of these concerns, and I don't agree with everything in Metaxas's book. I don't either. I read it, and I think it's overall very, very good, but I didn't agree with it all either. He goes on in the next paragraph on page 2. For me, Metaxas's book, though, is spot on in its central message, which is that many American Christians have been secularized to the point of insipidity. If we want to stave off the complete collapse of our society in our own day, Christian churches need to reform themselves from within. And yet, I see no impetus for that. Christianity applies to all of life. He quotes Francis Schaeffer's famous comment that he integrated into several of his books, and that is that if Christ is indeed Lord, he should be Lord of all of life. In spiritual matters, of course, but also just as much across the entire spectrum of life's issues, including intellectual issues and areas of culture, law, and government. So this is what we would refer to as holistic Christian discipleship or comprehensive Christian discipleship. And that is that it extends beyond, far beyond just our spiritual/religious lives into every area of our life. And he goes on to say that that idea that we should restrain our Christian faith to just the spiritual religious areas is the central lie of our time. And he quotes Eric Metaxas here, quote, Christian faith cannot, under any circumstances, confine itself to sermons or to Sunday mornings or to particular buildings or to merely ecclesiastical or religious issues. It will inevitably touch on everything. If it's true Christianity, it'll touch on everything, as it is precisely God's will for it to do so. It will have something to say about how our government operates and about every kind of issue, social issues, cultural issues, and otherwise. Now, this is so very important because I think there are Christians who stray beyond the boundaries. And his next section here of rejection of theocracy is something that Francis Schaeffer definitely emphasized. And we need to make this very, very clear because, you know, anytime Christians try to be influential in public life and politics and so on, they'll be accused of being, quote, Christian nationalists. Well, we should absolutely disavow that whole concept of Christian nationalism. In other words, we have absolutely no right to try and impose Christian values on mainstream society that's not Christian. So that's a term that is sometimes referred to in the past as Christian Reconstructionism. Sometimes you've probably seen the term theonomy or dominionism, and it's this idea that Christians should basically rule over society. Now, see, we have to understand that there are certain basic moral principles that we call natural law. And those basic moral principles apply to everyone, regardless of their religion or whatever, their philosophy or religion or whatever. But as Christians, we are called to observe those basic moral laws, but we're also called to a much higher standard as Christians. But that's not a standard we can impose or insist that others adopt. That's for people who have voluntarily received the grace of Jesus Christ and submitted their lives totally to Christ. And so he says in Schaeffer's time at the bottom of that page, some fringe Christian voices, R.J. Rushdoony is a good example, as well as some other names to throw out. Some fringe Christian voices were calling for a theocracy where the government would impose Christianity by force of law. And again, we need to vehemently deny that that is our agenda, okay? We want a nation that's governed by natural moral laws that apply to all humanity, okay? Schaeffer was absolutely opposed to that kind of thinking. And in his book, A Christian Manifesto, written in 1981, Schaeffer was unequivocal on this point. Quote, "We are not talking about some kind or any kind of a theocracy. There is no New Testament basis for a linking of church and state. And every time church and state in history has been linked, the church has become utterly corrupt, okay, from the time of Constantine, you know, on, all through the Middle Ages and so on. He talks, in fact, about the Constantine mentality, which, you know, typically in history, we refer to the age of Christendom, kind of a superficial, lowest common denominator, so-called Christianity that prevailed all through the Middle Ages and into modern times as well, until basically a couple of hundred years ago. He goes on to say on page 3, top of the page, in his book, A Christian Manifesto, Schaeffer was unequivocal. Okay, I quoted that. And if you come down several lines, as a result, Schaeffer wholeheartedly supported the American founders' vision of a limited government that secured liberty for all people, not just Christians. Okay. And he talks in the next paragraph about how that ethos that was promoted by America's founding fathers became such a factor in turning the tables against racism and calling for racial equality. And next paragraph down, in our own day, some on the fringe Christian right are calling for, you know, Christian rulers or Christian Reconstructionism, dominionism, theonomy. They pine for an authoritarian strongman who will come along and impose Christianity. Again, this is a problem we have to deal with directly and disavow very, very directly. We're not Christian nationalists, as the term is used. Now, however, having said that, any Christian who does take their political responsibility seriously is oftentimes maligned as a Christian nationalist by the militant secular media and so on. But, you know, there's relatively little we can do about that. They want to twist and distort reality and the truth, you know, in every respect. But we need to make it very, very clear, no, that's not our agenda whatsoever. So let me come down to the, on page 3 there, the right-hand column, the bottom, a willingness to act in an imperfect world. In Schaeffer's time, some evangelicals were reticent to become involved in politics. Well, that certainly has become the norm in many respects. They thought it was a distraction from the gospel. So when some Christians formed groups like the Moral Majority and so on to push back against public policies that they thought were anti-Christian, other Christians turned up their noses because the moral majority was imperfect. Well, of course it was imperfect. Everything human beings do is imperfect. Next paragraph, Schaeffer argued otherwise, though. He did not claim the moral majority was ideal. Some of us may perhaps have some questions about the moral majority. He certainly did, he wrote. But nonetheless, regardless of whether we think the moral majority has made some mistakes, they have certainly done one thing right. They've used the freedom we still have in the political arena to stand against the other total entity of materialism, secular humanism, and so on. They have carried the fact that law should be king, you know, the concept of lex rex. In other words, the law should supersede rulers, politicians, and so on. Law is above the lawmakers, and God is above the law into this area of life where it always should have been. And this is a part of true spirituality. And then he goes on to say, Schaeffer issued a challenge to the Christian critics of the moral majority. And there was plenty to criticize about that movement, by the way. But this is what Schaeffer says. If you personally do not like some of the details of what they've done, then go do it better, okay? But also keep in mind that they are accomplishing quite a lot that's positive. But if you don't agree with everything, you know, that the moral majority and groups like that did, well, then, you know, strive to do it better. But don't just totally, you know, ignore their agenda. Down at the bottom of the page, Metaxas gives the example of Christians who refrain from voting in an election because no candidate is good enough, even though one flawed candidate may be much better than another. Well, there's never been an election in you know, American history or human history where you had an ideal candidate. Washington had no opposition, did he? He was universally acclaimed as the greatest statesman of his time.
He was the center.
Yes, absolutely. And look, if we demand perfection, then we'll always get nothing. So we understand that all human beings are flawed. Some are far superior to others and would make far better, you know, officials than others. But we can't hold out for perfection. And I remember in the 2016 election, there was a pastor of a very prominent church here in Metro Atlanta who stood up in one of his sermons and made the proclamation that he could not vote for Donald Trump. And in the first place, I thought that was really irresponsible on his part. And frankly, when you consider the person Donald Trump was running against, it was, absolutely indefensible. And so the implication there was that Donald Trump does not meet my standards, and so on. But look, politics is mostly about damage control. It's mostly about containing evil as much as possible. And in that case, there was clear-cut option between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Yes.
He also couldn't vote for Jesus either.
Well, that's right. Jesus was not on the ballot, that year. And so this is just a totally irresponsible cop-out, this idea. There always somebody is preferable to the other body, okay? And it may be only slightly better, but usually there's a considerable difference. That certainly is the case in the current election when you look at the two candidates. Dan?
Jeffrey, I was just going to say, that comment from this pastor ties in perfectly with Megan Basham's critique and certainly the taxes critique, and that is the pastor didn't say, I just can't bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton. Right? In other words, these things only click in one direction. For some reason, the playing field is swept off from one side and not the other.
Yes.
If he condemned both,
Yes.
That would be one.
And not to interrupt you, but just very briefly, I mean, there's a lot that Donald Trump says and has done that's just embarrassing as can be. But again, what's the option? What's the alternative?
But not.
So we have to live in the real world.
Not when you call the clock. All right, that's where education comes in. You've got to be able to distinguish between a Hillary and a Trump and realize that there was, in terms of their political agenda or what their beliefs are, you've got to have an education in order to be able to make that decision.
A vast difference.
That pastor didn't have a clue in terms of what a constitutional republic meant versus a Marxist, redistribution of wealth or whatever. And you
see this is well, this is where we understand every human being has a personality, for better and for worse. And we can't act and think like children. See, children, how do they choose their friends and all? Well, it's all on the basis of he's cute or she's cute and he's funny and all this sort of thing. It's just very, very he's mean to me and so on. But that's how children think. Now, as adults, we have to think on a higher level, and the higher level is there are certain principles, there's certain policies and programs and priorities, and that's what we have to focus on. And when you think about principles, priorities, policies, and so on, quite a vast difference between most of these candidates, the Republican typically and the Democrat typically, a vast difference. And that's the level on which we have to think, and not, I don't like him. I don't like his personality. He's rude and crude and narcissistic, and all that very well may be true. But frankly, it's relatively unimportant compared to what he's going to do as in his political position.
Jeffrey?
That privilege to vote was bought with the blood of veterans, martyrs, it should be taken and taught as a sacred privilege, a sacred responsibility.
Yes, you're quite right.
Get up there and say that.
Yes, you're right. Let's see, I think I heard a comment from.
Yes.
Oh, Bob. Bob, can you speak as loudly as possible for the benefit of?
Yes, I was just wanting to comment on Albert Mohler's program today. Some of your group there would have heard him. I was fairly disturbed by it. He ended up at the end saying how good Trump would be next to the opposition, but he aired the dirty laundry, so to speak, of Trump's wavering on abortion. And I think that what people, what I'm afraid will happen in Georgia is many people just stay home. They get so disgusted and they say, well, I'm not going to vote for anyone. So I think that our spokesman, like Albert Mohler, has quite a following, and they need to be careful about bringing this out as one of their commentaries.
Well, he's quite right about that. Trump has backpedaled to the position on abortion he had years ago. But again, what's the alternative? The alternative is just outright evil. And so, you know, I think that we're not called to be apologists for Donald Trump, of course, but again, it's all relative to, you know, the other side and what they are peddling. You know, yes, Donna.
Well, I heard the Mueller commentary this morning, and I think he did balance it out. And he did say quite honestly what Trump said. He said, look at, like you said, look at the alternative. If we have Harris in there, we'll have unfettered abortion. They will push for a national law, undoubtedly. And that will absolutely be the agenda. Trump may not be like we want him to be. He may not be pro-life, but the alternative is much worse. Yes. As we've been saying.
Yes. Right. So we have to live in the real world and operate accordingly. And so let's try to contain as much evil as possible.
That's just one issue too. Exactly.
Yes, that's
just one issue.
Well, and
the
that
Democrats like to bring up, they can't bring up anything else.
you're quite right. And to us, I think that's the issue on which he's most vulnerable. So you're quite right. In you know, most of what he proposes, we would be in agreement with.
But it is also Al Mohler's hobby horse. That's his go-to thing. I mean, he tends to go to that more often than anything else in the political space.
Well, again,
and when he does go to geopolitical, he goes off the rails entirely, which I'm sort of glad he sticks to abortion.
Okay.
Well, it's
all right. Well,
on an ignorant electorate.
Yeah.
All that is dependent on.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're not educated. They don't have a clue about what form of government we have. They can't differentiate these kinds of things and make their own decision without having to have someone tell them how to think about.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, you have a quote from Churchill, I think, on that, don't you?
Oh, my favorite quote from Winston Churchill. He said that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Now, I think he was totally wrong. It only takes about a minute. So I think he was giving them far too much leeway in that regard.
Too much apathy with people, and they just go in the polls and say, incumbent, or, you know, that kind of thing. They just don't know.
Yeah. Well, let's move on here. And in the time we have remaining, and so page 4, the right-hand column, Francis Schaeffer's final book did not win him any plaudits from the cultural elites of his day, and that would include the Christian cultural elites. And Metaxas's current book likely won't win him much praise from current elites either. See, in his early years, Francis Schaeffer had been held up as kind of the hip evangelical thinker. He had a very avant-garde type of ministry at the Libri there here in Switzerland. It attracted hordes of young people and middle-aged folks as well. But by the late 60s, a lot of hippies were gravitating toward Libri and so on. So he was considered kind of the hip evangelical of the period. But he goes on to say that, and he has this undeniable mystique, as John West writes. And he even talked about things that conservatives don't want to talk about, like the evils of pollution, for instance, and racial equality, and so on, and the compassionate use of wealth and so on. But when Schaeffer saw the cultural collapse in America accelerating in the early 1970s, he made a fateful choice. His final books, How Should We Then Live? Whatever Happened to the Human Race, A Christian Manifesto, and The Great Evangelical Disaster, expressed with increasing clarity social and political views that were not hip at all. Schaeffer attacked Soviet bloc communism, and he defended the Christian influence on America's founding. This is something, again, we want to emphasize. And, we talked about Christian nationalism a while ago. Well, look, we need to emphasize that, again, America was probably the most Christian influenced nation in world history. And that is so much to be thankful for and to celebrate. That's not to say it was a, quote, Christian nation in any true sense, but it has been uniquely influenced by the Christian faith.
Read the Mayflower Compact.
Yeah, there's so many things like that that need to, again, be recognized as making America unique in all of world history. Yeah. He goes on at the bottom of that column. Schaeffer's final book critiqued evangelicals wrongly entranced by socialism and feminism. Now, I was involved in the Christian left for several years, and there were some, again, good people, nice people in that movement and all, but came to the realization that it's just fundamentally flawed and that it's totally out of sync with the realities of human nature and the realities of human behavior and all. But I'm not surprised that certain Christians are attracted to the so-called Christian left. I think I overheard, Dan, you mentioned something about Jim Wallace when you were talking. I didn't hear the context, but anyway, Jim Wallace would have been a leader in that Christian left, along with Ron Sider and Tony Campolo and people like that. All right. Page 5, Schaeffer's rise and fall among the cultural elites is neatly bookended by two articles. In 1960, Time ran a largely favorable profile titled Mission to Intellectuals, which described his growing outreach to the future shapers of our culture. As Time reported, quote, each weekend, the Schaeffers are overrun by a crowd of young men and women, mostly from the universities, painters, writers, actors, singers, dancers, and beatniks. That's the early 60s. It'd be hippies in the late 60s. 2 decades later, however, Newsweek ran its own profile of Francis Schaeffer, but this time the assessment was no longer sympathetic. The piece dripped with hostility and condescension. The article ended by quoting criticisms of Schaeffer by 2 professors from Wheaton College, often viewed as evangelicalism's Harvard. Well, it never was evangelicalism's Harvard, and it certainly isn't anymore. And anyway, he quotes the historian Mark Knoll, who sniped that the danger is that people will take Francis Schaeffer for a scholar, which he is not. Well, he was not a scholar in the sense that C.S. Lewis was a scholar, but nonetheless, he's very, very intellectually respectable. In his own book, Eric Metaxas warns against what he calls the idol of respectability, the tendency of many Christians to self-censor in order to speak or to seek the approval of the secular world. And again, we seem to be more conscious of that and trying to impress, the secular world than anything else. In fact, I believe it was last week we were talking about what's happened to Christianity Today magazine, which used to be really the prototype for evangelical American Christianity, founded by people like Carl F.H. Henry and Billy Graham and others. And it's become increasingly woke in recent years. And so much of evangelicalism is following that trend. And one thing that one of the editors of Christianity Today said recently is that, we used to be so excited whenever an article appeared in Christianity Today, and then it was picked up in a mainline liberal institution like the Atlantic magazine or New York Times, and we'd feel, yeah, we've really made the big time. That even the big, mainstream secular publications recognize, our great contributions and all. So that's a dangerous trend, to say the least. So Eric Metaxas warns against what he calls the idol of respectability, the tendency of many Christians to self-censor in order to seek the approval of the secular world. So let me finish this up on page 5 there, the right-hand column, come down midway. Schaeffer's life shows how spurning the idol of respectability can be used powerfully by God, though. Scorned by the elites of his day, Francis Schaeffer ended up having a far greater influence on American culture than many of his critics. His writings, lectures, film series helped mobilize thousands of evangelicals to enter academia, the arts, politics, law, journalism. I remember just being so enthralled and impressed by Francis Schaeffer back in the early 70s. And this was before I discovered C.S. Lewis to any real extent. And I just thought, wow, this guy's really impressive. I mean, he's culturally aware of what's going on, and he's applying his Christian faith to all these cultural trends. And I thought, I never really, noticed any other evangelical leaders, of that type. And so excellent article by John West. Again, you can read the blurb there on John West. And like I said, I think he's one of the most impressive Christian commentators and thinkers of our time, vice president of the Discovery Institute, and so on. So let me just pause here. We're quickly approaching the limit of our time. Any comments, questions before we kind of wrap things up? Dan,
No,
go.
It's his turn. Is it my turn? It's your turn. He does mention that Metaxas has this thing about purity, and actually, I think the word Metaxas uses piety. Maybe a type of graphical error, but it does make a difference in terms of the piety versus purity.
Oh, you're talking about pietism.
Right.
Yeah, pietism.
Yeah, so
that seeks to reduce Christian discipleship down to just our religious and spiritual life. Yeah.
That to me is a far more devastating thing than just simple purity.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
On that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. Pietism, the idea that, again, politics is dirty and corrupt and whatever. And, real Christians don't want anything to do with it, So.
In reading Religious Christianity, he takes a very negative definition of religion because he's looking at it from its failures rather than from what it could possibly do. So just keep that in mind when you read the book. And also note that it's the name of the same book that Michael Horton wrote 14 years ago. So by the same thing. So that's also a good book as well.
Okay.
But Metaxas is addressing addressing a very specific point in time, and Horton is looking more longitudinally over a longer period of time.
Okay. Mhm.
And then you go back from religionless to Christless stuff, which,
Go ahead.
oh, I thought you were,
No, go ahead.
you can go back to B.B. Warfield, who wrote Christless Christianity, and then you have others. So it's not a new theme. It's one that goes on for some time. I read Religionless Christianity, and it's well worth the read. And I would suggest that the two books address two different audiences. The first book, the letter, addresses specifically the leadership of the church and its apathy. And the second one addresses the church laity and its people. I think that's a good thing to understand.
Okay. All right, so I would like to finish up here. And we didn't plug in, did we, for the. I'd like to finish up. Dolly and I, we went to England a couple of weeks ago. It was a very rushed trip over there. We were planning the details of a upcoming Areopagus tour. We used to do those every year until COVID came along and interrupted everything. But we'd like to do a tour early next year, actually in April, on the journeys of Paul. And so while we were there, we wanted to be sure and go and see the stage play of Les Miserables. And how many of you have seen it, by the way? Oh, dear. Oh,
I've seen the movie.
oh, okay. No. No, it is really phenomenal. The stage presentation is just absolutely phenomenal. And we saw it about 5 or 6 years ago or so when we were there, but I'd never realized the spiritual content in Les Miserables until this time. I must be a very slow learner or something, but I was so impressed. And I felt like it really has a lot to contribute to this course and how we're thinking about our role in society and all. And so I wanted to play a couple of the songs from Les Miserables, which I think really do address our situation in America. Now, of course, if you know the background for Les Miserables, it takes place in France in the 19th century. Now, the French were constantly having revolutions and killing people just for the sheer enjoyment of it all. And every couple of decades or so, there'd be another revolution break out. And Les Miserables actually focuses on the what's called the revolt, the June revolt of 1832, where students took over part of Paris and barricaded themselves. Now, again, the governments in France, going back for many, many centuries, had just been utterly corrupt. You had the Bourbon dynasty, the Louis XIV and Louis XVI and so on. You had the French Revolution, which was just a bloody mess, of course, very anti-Christian and anti-civilization, basically. Then, of course, Napoleon comes along and ends the French Revolution by installing a dictatorship, a military dictatorship. In the process, he was responsible for killing millions of Europeans, of course, in his grandiose plans to conquer Europe and so on. Well, he was finally contained, as you know, and then the Bourbon dynasty was once again restored, and it was every bit as corrupt and horrible as it had ever been. So throughout the 19th century, you have these periodic revolutions. Now, this is not an endorsement of the revolt of 1832 necessarily, but in their minds, these students who barricaded the streets and took up arms and all, in their minds at least, they were fighting for justice and against this very horrible government. So they saw themselves as the true proletariat standing up against their bourgeois, oppressors and so on. So again, the historical context aside, there are lots of flaws and, that whole scenario. What matters is people risking their lives for what they passionately believe is true and good and just. And I think in that respect, we can learn considerably from their example. So let me, this is going to be, can you go ahead and start it up there? And the volume, just the volume would have to be up. And, very generating music about people who passionately believe in what they're fighting for, and they're willing to lay down their life for it. And again, the details about French history and everything aside, doesn't it reflect, at least to some extent, how we should approach our lives and the privileges that God has granted us, and in the service of His agenda. And now, again, this is a song about revolution and so on. But I think again, the general meaning of it is very, very applicable to us. Now, I'll play a part of the next song, and Paul, it starts at the 6-minute, 20-second mark. You might want to kill the volume. So this is the epilogue to the entire Les Miserables stage play. And this is what really struck me as having so much spiritual applicability. And so as soon as we get it, which song is it? It's number 2, and the 6-minute, 20-second mark is where we start.
Oh, don't steal it.
They have to know the story, on that basis. So just a moment here, and we'll finish our session with this part. Again, this is the epilogue, and again, based on what I said about the previous song, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" I think you'll find this to be very, very inspiring as well. I mean, God has arranged for our lives so that we're living right here, right now, at this time in history for a particular purpose. So let's take that with utmost seriousness.
Amen.
And what is it that God intends for us in terms of being a source of light and love, true love and truth and hope in this increasingly decadent world. I will. Okay, can you turn it all the way up? I mean, does that not have so much applicability to our situation?
Amen. Yeah.
Let's join in the crusade that God has invited us to be a part of it and change this world, change our world. But let's be a source of light and love and hope and truth in this increasingly darkened society and culture. And let's try to promote as much peace and love and truth as possible.
You get somebody else.
Comment?
Dave Jordan was trying to say something.
They didn't have a speaker on it.
Actually,
Okay, I believe somebody was making a comment here, and then we'll close things out. Am I wrong? Okay. Well, check out the soundtrack for Les Miserables sometime, read about it. Again, it has a very Christian, moral, spiritual theme to it. And I just found it, I think we both found it just incredibly inspiring. So check it out, the music in it is just phenomenal. So.
I'll crank my stereo up in the track.
Pardon me?
I'll crank my stereo. up
Please
in the track.
do. Yes, yes. All right. Well, good being with you all. And those of you who joined us online as well, always great to have you all joining us. If you have an opportunity to join us in person, please don't hesitate. We have a enjoyable dinner and conversation before our class begins, but it's nonetheless great to see you all. So blessings on the rest of your week, and let's do resolve to be sources of love, light, hope, and truth. And that's why God has granted us, with life right here, right now. So blessings, good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.